been such a cool, just re-engaging with a topic in Scripture that I think for many of us who have been a part of church for a long time are super familiar with, the idea of abiding. And in John 15 specifically, the idea of remaining and abiding is something that a lot of us have heard about. And as I was sitting in these verses, preparing for this, and I'll be honest, when Steve asked me to tackle this topic in the larger series of Becoming, I was a little like, oh, okay. Doesn't seem super exciting. We've all heard a few sermons on that before, but it was such a gift to receive kind of what I think was a new lens from the Lord as I was coming into this. So I hope that you hear that as I share a little bit this morning with you. I'm just going to start out by saying, just telling you a little story about myself and a little bit about my life when it comes to this idea of abiding and remaining. Most of my life, I have thought of myself as a pretty authentic person. I kind of think what you see is what you get with me. I wouldn't say that I'm a person that thinks of myself as overly like striving or someone who struggles with performance. And often I think when I've heard this idea of abiding or this sermon being preached before, it's from the angle often of we don't have to strive, we don't have to perform in order to find presence in Jesus's love or to stay connected with him. And there's for sure been aspects of that I have learned from, but I haven't really resonated with that idea. And for many people that I know that striving and kind of performing and doing and being someone who is aware of how they look in the world and at all times, and that can be kind of consuming. I have lots of friends where that is true. It's not something that I have felt really resonated with me. But as I was sitting this week, I was reminded that over the last few years, I've really come to see that I do, while it might not be this idea of like performing and striving to attain or to live in a very optimal kind of idea of myself in the world and to portray that out into the world, I do see that there are two sides of me that I kind of wrestle with which one of them that I bring to the Lord and which one of them I sit in my relationship with him. There is a version of me that is the one that is very hopeful and is positive and kind of taking the things. I've grown up in the church my whole life, and I've heard a lot about, being a person of hope and, just having this mindset of hope and positivity and seeing things through a lens that is kingdom-minded. And I've taken a lot of that to heart. And so I have this side of me that wants to seem like things are going fine. And that's not just for the outside world, that's for myself. I think I have wanted those things to be true. And I have often done that for myself. And I've done that when I've kind of been sitting in those moments with Jesus as well. But then if I'm honest, there is a version of me that's a little bit more honest and that I've given myself a little bit more room for in the last few years. And that's the one that is tired sometimes, distracted a lot of the time, unsure and not so hopeful, and one that doesn't feel as positive as I'd like her to feel a lot of the time. And that first version is the one that I've brought into my relationship with Jesus for most of my life. And in ministry, I've been in a lot of conversations with people who are kind of wrestling with the same idea. I've sat in kind of prayer ministry and emotional kind of healing ministry and small groups with people that just straight up have said to me, nope, I cannot be angry at God. There is no room for me to bring my anger to the Lord. I refuse to do it. Don't make me do it. I'm not going to do it. And I get that. Even in those moments where people have been given the opportunity in safe places and in community to engage honestly. For some of us, it's really, really hard. And I have been learning that actually that comes out of this place of it feels safer sometimes for some of us, whether it is those of us who are wrestling with striving and trying to perform out of a place of accomplishment or what we look like to the world, or for those of us who might be a little bit more similar to me, who are just wrestling with what it means to be hopeful and honest with the Lord, that often this like positivity and hopefulness that I am like putting on that lacks honesty is a place of trying to stay safe in a lack of vulnerability, even with Jesus, definitely with myself and in the world. And it's not because anyone told me to do that. It is literally just what I have felt like. It's just because it feels safer to me. But what I've been learning is that you can't actually stay with Jesus, and you can't actually stay within the love of Jesus and be present in that if you're only bringing a version of yourself to him. And at some point, it just becomes fake. You're just caught up in a cycle of doing what you know to do, or pretending, or putting something on that isn't authentic. Or you can choose to let yourself be known. The life that Jesus offers us, this journey of becoming that we've been talking about the last few weeks, and the transformation that we're actually longing for, doesn't begin with trying harder or putting on that striving version of ourselves or a dishonest version of ourselves that looks really hopeful and optimistic, full of what we know we should say or do. It begins with staying and remaining and abiding. And I think that matters because a lot of us are really tired, not just physically, but spiritually. Not because we don't care about Jesus and not because we don't care about that transformation and the becoming that Jesus is offering us, but because somewhere along the way, following him started to feel like doing more or putting in more effort or more discipline or more consistency. And even if we're good at things, at like making time for prayer or spending time in the Word or being a part of community, and even though we acknowledge that all of those things are good, some of those things can start to feel like pressure. And I think that what we've been talking about the last few weeks has been leading up to this point of where, identifying these areas where this relationship with Jesus that each of us is having, and that this journey of becoming that we are each on individually, but also as a community, that we don't want that to feel like striving, and we don't want it to feel like putting on something that isn't authentic or fixing ourselves, but we want it to feel like it is an overflow and something that is coming out of our relationship with Jesus authentically. So we're going to be in John 15, these familiar verses for many of us. I'm just going to read them. John 15, verses 1 through 9. Jesus says, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown in the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Now remain in my love." So that verse 4, remain in me as I also remain in you, is kind of where we're landing and staying today. So not achieve more, not fix yourself, not try harder, remain, and stay. So we've been talking these last few weeks about this idea of becoming, not as fixing, not as turning back towards, but as turning back towards Jesus. And last week we were invited to notice the places where Jesus is working in our lives and the invitation that he's extending to us to more with him. And this week is the next step. It's not just about the noticing. I want to just put out there that it's about staying in that noticing. Staying long enough to actually be changed. And this isn't easy for a lot of us. The staying and the remaining. That word remaining is repeated so many times in this verse. I meant to count them and I didn't. But in these verses, that word remaining, it feels like the first few times I read it, it felt like almost like this grading thing, remaining. How many places in our lives currently are we invited to or even instructed to remain? I feel like the world, in just our regular lives, does the complete opposite, that the invitation is, oh no, don't stay there for too long. Move along, quicker, move on. So I want to invite you, just now you can call it out. I want to ask you, when life gets busy or overwhelming, what's the first thing that tends to pull you away from being present with Jesus? That's not your priority in that moment, yeah. Work commitments. Yeah. Distractions, yeah. And a to-do list. We all have them. Yeah, Jacob. Being angry with God, yeah. Yeah, being impatient. Yeah, these are all very real and things that most of us can identify with, I think. And that's exactly why Jesus' invitation of remaining, I think, feels really uncomfortable when we read it. But why it matters so much and why I think it's repeated so many times in these verses. Because I think Jesus acknowledged, even in the time that he was living in, and probably even more so now in our time and moment in history, that life pulls us and feelings pull us and everything around us is pulling us away from remaining. He expects that we're going to be distracted and that we're going to have hard feelings to process and that we have other obligations and to-do lists, but he beckons us to remain despite those things. And he invites us over and over and over again. Jesus says, remain in me. And that word in the Greek, as it's originally written, is meno. And at its core, meno means to stay and to dwell, to continue and to make your home. It's not like a quick action-oriented word. It's relational and ongoing, and it has this sense of like a settledness. It's not just stay connected. And I've heard that lens sometimes when it comes when these verses and this idea of remaining and abiding being taught, that it's, I've heard like illustrations of, it's like remaining is like not just plugging in, your phone charger for a few minutes and then unplugging it. That actually to get a charge in your phone, you have to keep it like plugged in for a little while, and you have to wait for it to fully charge. But actually, the Greek word meno is more than the idea of connectedness. It has this idea of dwelling and making your home. It's this invitation to make your home here. Live out of this place with me, Jesus is saying. which means that Jesus isn't inviting us into this series of spiritual moments, which I don't know about you, but I have been caught up in this idea that, there is this like returning work that I always have to do. I have to turn back to Jesus for this next moment of prayer. I have to return back to Jesus for this moment of studying and being in the Word or being in community, even showing up here on Sunday. This is me reorienting or returning to Jesus. But he's actually inviting us into this shared life with him. And I think for a lot of us, if we're honest, we visit Jesus. We check in, we have moments, we show up, but we don't stay. It's like the difference between a hotel and a home. So when you're in a hotel, it's temporary. You bring a version of yourself. You bring your work conference self, or you bring your parent on family vacation self, or I'm here visiting family for some kind of family obligation self to the hotel, and you know that you're leaving. But when you're at home, you exhale, you're known, you stay, you bring your authentic self in your home. And Jesus is saying, I'm not a place you visit, I'm a place you live. And to make it even more powerful, he says, as I also remain in you. The meno is reciprocal and relational. We stay with Jesus, and he is also staying with us, which is one of these things, like the Trinity and God's kingdom and so many other things that for humans, for us, is something that I can't even begin to explain to you how that works. But even in that word meno, it isn't a one-sided idea. There is an idea and an expectation of relationship and reciprocity that's happening in there. Author Sarah Bessey wrote about this idea in her blog this past Advent season. She was talking about the idea of Emmanuel and God with us. And she was drawing from she's had some recent experience, I guess, with exploring Celtic Christianity. And she was unpacking this idea of indwelling, which is another translation of this word abide in Scripture. And Celtic Christianity has a really, really powerful and deep sense of the of the concept of God's Spirit indwelling in us as humans, in the created world around us, and in our day-to-day life. And it's this idea that Jesus is not just near us, but that he's with us. In Colossians 1, it says, Christ is in you, the hope of glory. And in John 14, Jesus says, we will come to them and make our home with them. So we will dwell with them. Sarah Bessey writes in that blog, she says, we are abiding within the love of God, dwelling within as comfortable as home. And so God dwells within us. There is a restfulness to the word dwell. It eschews striving and achieving and earning, doesn't it? If we are abiding in the love of God and God is indwelling in us, then God is quite at home in us and in our world. And we are right where we belong when we live as if we are loved, because we are. So we don't just bring Jesus into our lives. We don't tidy up the house in preparation for his visit and then invite him inside for dinner. He's already made his home in us. Abiding isn't about working to be right with Jesus. It's not about putting on that hopeful self like I've done for a lot of my life. It's not about putting on that positive outlook and ignoring the hard things. It's not tidying up the home before Jesus comes in. It's about learning to live from where he already is. And if that's true, then we can learn to live like we're at home in the love of God. And that's what the invitation of Jesus in these verses in John 15 actually point to. How can we be living out of a place of home and a security that comes from knowing that we are at home in the love of Jesus? So here's the challenge. Most of us don't stay there in that invitation, we've done the work that we talked about last week of noticing where Jesus is in the hard things and in the good things. We notice, but we don't stay. We don't stay long enough for that really, for that work to actually shape us. So for me in my life, this has looked like, this has been a journey kind of that's been happening, not purposefully, but kind of hand in hand with this journey of becoming more honest with myself and in my relationship with God and just in the world, and not being so toxically positive. But there's been this other journey that's been happening for me that has been about kind of understanding myself. And I think I've talked a little bit about this here, but knowing more of myself and who I am, who I come from, the land that I come from, the land that I live on, and what is just true of how God created me uniquely and individually as a person, and what is the invitation in those places. And that's been, it's like I say it now and it sounds like so obvious, like that's something that we should all be doing. But actually, for me, it's been a very big challenge. And I think that for a lot of us in the church, but for lots of different reasons, it's really hard. Like we have, there's a lot of things that we have learned to either just not value or to look past or to ignore about who we are specifically and uniquely and purposefully in this world. And that journey for me has brought me to like a few things that have been a little hard for me to kind of rest in and remain in. And one of them, it sounds so trivial, but it has been huge, has been my parents a few years ago when they retired. They used to live just in Durham region, very close to me. And they hated living in the suburbs their whole life. They were miserable. And so the second that they were both able to retire and not work anymore, they packed it up and they moved to the Bruce Peninsula. And so that's been 3.5, 4 hours away from us. That's been very hard in lots of ways. But they are living their best life and they have a beautiful home in a beautiful part of the world. They found community. And for the first few years, they've been there now for about, I think it's 8 years full time. And for the first few years of going up and spending time with them, it would feel like going to the cottage. It would feel like we would arrive and we would show up and we would enjoy the access to the water and the nature. But as years went on, it started to feel more like a second home to me. And I really wrestled with that because I don't have access to nature and to the pace of life that they have up there. And so it was almost like this like whiplash experience sometimes when that was happening. It was one thing when it was like a cottage mindset because you can prepare yourself, but when it started feeling a little bit more like home or a second home for me, that was harder because it felt like I was moving from this very fast-paced life to the pace of life that they had up there. And then I was also wrestling with feelings of, oh, actually, I really love this. I didn't know. I've always lived, I've known that I loved creation, love camping, love being out in nature. But I think what I experienced once I had a version of home living like that, started to realize, oh no, actually this does something really like transformative to me when I'm up here. And I didn't know what to do with that. I thought maybe at first it was about like wanting something different than what I have, or the grass is always greener on the other side. I spent a lot of years kind of being hard on myself, thinking that that's what it was. I wondered if it was just about to be less like responsibilities and a slower pace of life. And when I had young kids, that seemed really appealing. But after a few years, I started to realize, you know what? Actually, as I got more honest with myself, that this is something unique and specific that God has created inside of me that I actually do. And that took so long for me to be able to get to a place to be honest with myself, because it feels like this world that I live in anyways doesn't really give us a lot of room or permission to say, you know what, if I could do it over again, I don't know that I would choose to live in the suburbs. I don't know that I would choose to live where I live. I don't know that we have a lot of permission to do that unless we are prepared to take action. And I'm not prepared to take action. I'm not prepared to pick up my life and move out east or move somewhere else. And so, like, if you can't do something with it, if you can't do something with the feeling or the invitation or the realization, I don't know that we know what to do with that. And so I avoided it for a really long time. But recently, just in the last year, it was about a year ago, I just brought it to God and said, I don't know what to do with this. I don't plan. I don't want to move. We've talked about that. I'm not looking for a solution, but I know that you have created me with this like deep appreciation for creation. And beyond that, I think that I feel your love the most when I have access to forests and water and all of the things. And in the last year, since I have been honest with God about that, I have just seen like just the most ridiculous things, like not anything crazy. It's not like there now is so much more. It's not loud. There's not like I have now so much access to nature and I've seen all of this, beautiful transformative stuff. But I have seen something blossom inside of myself where all of a sudden now I find ways to connect with God that just come out of this very organic and like real place to me. So things like caring about like the parks in my area, which is not something that like I want to do out of myself from like I don't need more things to be involved in. I don't need more like committees to be a part of. I don't need more things to follow on social media. I don't need any of that. But as soon as I was able to kind of recognize in myself, oh no, I actually have this I actually care about when trees disappear from my community. I actually care about people having access to hiking paths and trails and that they're preserved well. And I actually care about knowing the story of the people whose land this was before Canada became Canada. As soon as I started acknowledging that, all of a sudden, I wanted to know, what's happening over on that piece of land that's being developed. And it came out of these very natural places. The other thing that happened was that all of a sudden, I had opportunities to spend more time in nature that I think are doors that only God could open. And so I have wanted to travel in Canada. I've never been west of Ontario since I've lived in Canada. And so all of a sudden this year I've had and am going to have so many opportunities to travel across the country through my work and through my studies. And those are just doors that God has opened. And I got to see mountains last week for the first time. It was amazing. And those are things that I never, sorry, I'm getting emotional talking about it, but those are things that I never would have given myself permission to value before, because it costs money to travel and it costs money, takes time away from my family or from my kids. But actually the life that God poured into me last week, just being in nature and seeing the Rocky Mountains for the first time, I was like this the whole time. It was wild. And that is kind of a really abstract concept of what this is. And I think that there can be much more concrete versions of what this looks like in our life. But it really did come from this place of realizing that these invitations from Jesus don't have to be productive. They don't have to be places where that makes sense for us. But just to be able to show up in our relationship with Jesus and be like, I know I can be secure in who you have created me to be uniquely. And these things might not be productive things, but I really care about whatever, nature. I really care about cars. I really care about, playing road hockey with my kids, whatever it is. And that it doesn't have to make sense, but that when we give ourselves permission to just live in those places and trust that when we are living in those places, really, really making room and living out of the indwelling presence of Jesus, that we can just, like, God's love really pours out of those places and we can see him show up. Jesus says, no branch can bear fruit by itself, and a branch doesn't produce fruit by trying harder, which is something that I think a lot of us have heard a lot. And I would say a branch doesn't produce fruit by being more hopeful. A branch doesn't produce fruit by being more positive. A branch doesn't produce fruit by ignoring what's hard in our lives. It produces fruit by staying connected. And this is where we get it backwards, because we focus on the fruit. We think, oh, I need to be more patient, or I need to be more kind, I need to be more loving. And if, I just trying to change my mindset to be more kind and more loving, if I spend more time listening to positive people, if I kind of hang out with more positive people, or if I, read some books about how I can be more positive, and if I change the inputs that are coming into my life and into my heart, that, that's how I'm going to actually produce this fruit. And while I think a lot of those things can be really helpful, I think Jesus is pointing to more than that. He's telling us that the way to the fruit is just by being connected to the vine and living out of that place of being aware of the indwelling love of Jesus, making a home in us. We remain and fruit grows, but remaining doesn't mean that we leave when things get uncomfortable or when they get slow. And that was a big one for me. When things are slow, I have a very hard time. Or unclear, or unproductive. Because transformation doesn't happen instantly, it happens over time. So I'm just going to ask you to try something with me for a minute, kind of like what Blair did earlier. It's like we planned it. But if, just to invite you again, just to sit comfortably with your feet on the floor, and I'm just going to ask you to sit in silence for 60 seconds. And for some of us, this is going to be easier than for others. But while you're sitting in this silence, I want you to notice what's happening in your body and in your mind and in your emotions during this time. Don't shut anything down or force a perfect version or a positive version or a hopeful version. Just notice. I'm just going to pray, and then we'll start the 60-second timer. Jesus, we know that you're with us and you've made your home in us. In this moment, we're sitting in that place, making our home in you and in your love. In this moment, help us not to just notice where we're being pulled away, but where you are inviting us to stay. So Blair was just sharing that this idea, similar to what Dana had shared about invitation, and this invitation into the awareness that Jesus is already there. The invitation isn't to, you didn't say this, Blair, but the invitation isn't to invite Jesus in. He's already there. And the invitation is the awareness piece and then staying in that spot. And I think what I hear is like trusting and having a security like we do. We trust that our lungs are going to keep doing what they do, and trusting that in the same way Jesus is going to do what he says he's going to do through his love in us. And I would say, like, these are the places, and maybe as you're processing this week, the idea of longings came up at our table. And I think that's a great part of this too, that as we remain, I think it is a part of the reason why it can be uncomfortable is that in those places, when we stay there for a long time, maybe longings come up, and maybe longings that we don't know what to do with. And that can be really hard. And so, how do we sit in those places and feel those feelings and honor Jesus in them? And if we skip through the discomfort, and if we skip through the hard feelings, and if we skip through just the things that get brought up in those places of remaining, we move straight into doing often. And we talked a little bit, won't get into the whole thing, but a little bit about the idea of devotions. And I was saying that devotions for a long time in my life were daily devotions were very normal for me. And then I took a break for a while because didn't have this language for it, but I started to feel like devotions were these places where I was establishing this habit of plugging the plug in for a little bit and then unplugging it. And I didn't like seeing that I was enforcing this habit in my life instead of just finding more natural ways of relationship with Jesus. And I think that was a way for me through devotions, and there's been other practices that I've had in my life and actually nature has been one of them. I think in the past, before I had this experience of knowing that this was something deep for me and part of who I was, I remember for a season I was like, oh, well, spending time in nature is like a spiritual pathway to me. And so then I made it a practice in my life, and quickly found out that as soon as it became a practice, that it lost a lot of the connection that I had originally felt. And it became about the doing, and it became about the pressure to do it, and it wasn't flowing out of a place of knowing myself and knowing God's love from me. It was coming out of a place of, oh, this is how I think I should connect with God instead. And I think that that's really common in our lives, that when we move really quickly from, okay, God, I notice you in this place, I hear you, and now I'm going to go do. I'm going to go serve. I'm going to go do this spiritual practice. I'm going to use my gifts in that ministry. I think it leads to at least disillusionment. Oh, I'm just not good at connecting with God. Prayer's just not my thing. Or I just don't hear God that clearly. Or I don't see God in my life like other people do. And at worst can lead to burnout. And can really influence and change our mindset and our idea of community, the community of Christ, of God's love, and so many things. Because we're trying to produce something that only grows out of connection with Jesus, without abiding. And so community becomes performance, and serving becomes pressure, and calling becomes anxiety. But if we can do the abiding piece well, if we can do the remaining piece well and stay there, we know that we are already at home. We stop trying to earn our place, and we don't have to prove ourselves. We don't have to perform. We can just show up. And I have found, and I think you've heard a little bit in my story, I found that when I can do that, that's when I actually see God move in the world around me in ways that mean something to me and make an impact in how I actually live out my life and what I prioritize and how much capacity I have. And that's when doors start to open and opportunity happens, and it's not forced. And I don't feel burned out and exhausted and tired all the time. I actually feel like, no, I want to go do that thing, and I want to go have that conversation, and I want to go serve in my community and show up on Sunday or do whatever it is, because it's coming from these places of just connection with God that hasn't been as a result of performance. And so I just want to invite us, as we go about our week this week, to hold on to this idea of coming home or staying home. And so we're taking the idea that we had last week of practicing noticing, and then we talk about that a lot in this community of noticing where Jesus is. And so it's taking that idea and just acknowledging, Jesus, you are here. I know you are here. I might not feel it, but that's okay. I know, and I am secure in the idea and in your words in John 15 that you remain in me. And I'm choosing to live in that confidently. And then to be present in that moment, not fixing, not striving, not changing when a thought comes into our minds that we think, no, that's not helpful right now. Not fixing it, not striving, just being aware like we practiced. And then remaining, stay for a little bit longer than you normally would. Stay beyond what's comfortable, maybe. And I didn't put it here, but I would say to take it even one step further, because I heard some really great conversation and I think that we can do it. As those things get brought up in these moments where you've remained, and maybe it's a longing, or maybe it's just like an awareness of who God has created you to be that doesn't feel super productive, or maybe like you're like, I haven't wanted to say this out loud because it kind of sounds like I'm not grateful for something in my life, to share that with somebody, to actually, whether it's in like your small group this week or with your partner or with a friend, just to share, like, yeah, you don't have to explain the whole thing, but just to say, you know what, I think God's inviting me into this thing. And that's like, for sure, like ask for accountability, but beyond that, I think when we hear ourselves put words to some of these things out loud, that sometimes we can hear, and even this morning as I was sharing my story a little bit with you, I hear, like, to me, these things feel huge and really difficult and challenging. But then when I hear myself say them out loud, sometimes I'm like, it's really basic. It's not that big of a deal. And sometimes I think when we can do that in relationship, it's really helpful and healing for us to realize, if someone else said this to me, I'd be like, yeah, sounds great. No big deal. Sounds like a really beautiful invitation actually from the Lord. And you might find that somebody might have the capacity to hold you accountable and also like help you in moving and seeing what that could look like as it becomes a fuller idea. And maybe you can move into it in your life and in your relationship with Jesus. So let me just pray for us as we go about our week. God, I thank you for just this like invitation in John 15. And it's this invitation, like it's not, you repeat it over and over and over again in these verses, remain in me, and as I remain in you. And you give this beautiful illustration of the vine to help us to understand that, it's an invitation to something that may feel uncomfortable and may take some, may cause some discomfort. But actually, it's how you've created us to be, just as the branch is created to be connected to the vine. And the branch would have no life if it was apart from the vine. And we choose to believe your words in these verses, God, that actually the best thing that we can do as branches is to be connected to you, and that it is in those places where we be as branchy as possible, connected to you as the vine, just doing what you have created us to do, that we will see just the fullness of your love as it spills out and pours out of us. And God, I just pray that as each of us go about our week this week, that we might find moments of noticing just little glimpses of you and staying there a little bit longer, and help us to encourage each other as we do that this week. We pray that as we go from here, that you would be so close to us in everything that we do, and that we would keep that awareness of your indwelling presence in us in everything that we are doing this week. That we would remember that we don't have to tidy anything up to invite you in, that you're already in there. That might make us really uncomfortable, might be really messy in there, but you're already there, and that's right where you want to be. In your name we pray all of these things. Amen. Thanks, guys. Have a great week. I don't think there's anything else I have to have announcements or anything to share. And we'll see you next week.